the current state of U.S.-Russia relations is at a low point. There is a low level of trust between our two countries. As to the question of the interference with the election, that is fairly well established in the United States, and I think that has been spoken to on the Hill as well with the Congress, and it is a serious issue. It's one that we know is serious enough to attract additional sanctions.
This week, during his first visit to Moscow as Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson continued the Trump administration's new tough talk on Russia. During Tillerson's eventual 2-hour-long meeting Wednesday with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Vladimir Putin, the former oil executive and the Russians couldn't agree on much. On the question of whether Russian ally Bashar al-Assad can remain the president of Syria, Tillerson and the Russian leaders were not on the same page. On the fact that Assad was responsible for the chemical weapons blast that killed more than 80 people this month, the two parties could not disagree more. And on the issue of Russian interference in the U.S. election, there was no consensus. Meanwhile, the Trump administration's ties to Russia continue to raise concerns here at home. Trump's senior advisor and son-in-law Jared Kushner is the latest official to come under scrutiny. In January, when completing the national security questionnaire required for top security clearance, Kushner failed to disclose his dozens of meetings with foreign leaders, including Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak and the leader of a Russian state-owned bank. Kushner's lawyer said the FBI questionnaire was submitted prematurely and that Kushner will provide additional information soon. In the meantime, 5 Democratic congressmen wrote a letter to the FBI and the Office of Personnel Management on Thursday to request the suspension of Kushner's security clearance. And joining me now is one of the men who signed that letter, Representative Ted Lieu. And so, Congressman, do you have an expectation that this letter will result in Kushner's security clearance actually being pulled, or is this really just to get it on the record that he essentially did the same thing Michael Flynn did and not disclosed his connections and his conversations?
Thank you, Joy, for that question. Kushner's security clearance absolutely should be suspended. I have filled out these forms before. They're known as SF-86 forms. One of the main reasons that you have this form is to figure out if the person had contacts with foreign officials. Jared Kushner intentionally omitted his various contacts, and he knew these contacts were important because of the whole Russia scandal that has been developing. So he lied, and he needs to have his security clearance revoked.
And just so that people understand what this questionnaire is, so there are rules involved in it. It's a questionnaire that you have to fill out in order to get your security clearance to do the job that he's doing. One of the quotes from the questionnaire from the FBI that he's required to fill out says, the U.S. Criminal Code, Title 18, Section 1001 provides that knowingly falsifying or concealing a material fact is a felony, which may result in fines and up to 5 years imprisonment. And Congressman, we know that it's a rarely enforced law. People don't often go to prison for it. Is it enough, in your view, that Kushner has said he will revise the forms, which is what people normally do?
No, it is not. If I had done this on my own forms, my security clearance would have been suspended and there would have been an investigation opened. And the difference with Kushner is it's not as if he omitted a meeting he had 4 years ago. He had these meetings with Russian officials recently, and he knew this was an issue because of the Russia scandal. So he intentionally omitted these facts. That's why his security clearance needs to be either suspended or revoked.
And if that doesn't happen, what would be your next move as a member of Congress?
You know, if we take back the House in a year and a half, then we will open investigations to try to force him to do that. In the meantime, I hope some Republicans come to their senses and understand the gravity of what happened here, where you have a senior-level White House official lying about his security clearance form on the issue of Russia.
It sounds like you are making that a campaign issue. Are you saying that if Democrats take back the House of Representatives, that they are going to ramp up investigations on Russiagate, including on Jared Kushner?
We will ramp up investigations on any alleged violations of the law or of ethics. And if nothing happens when people lie on the security clearance forms, that's absolutely a problem. We will absolutely investigate.
Are you implying there that the Republicans are not doing a thorough investigation at this moment?
That's correct. I have heard nothing about their investigation of people who lie on the security clearance forms, including Jared Kushner.
All right. We'll leave it there. Congressman Ted Lieu, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And joining me now, Professor of International Affairs at the New School, Nina Khrushcheva, and Vladimir Kara-Murza, Vice Chairman of Open Russia and the man who was poisoned in Moscow twice, presumably for his opposition to the current Russian leadership. Thank you both for being here. A lot to get to and to talk about. I want to first come to you, Nina, on this question of what now appear to be some open disagreements between the United States and Russia. I think a lot of people on the Trump side of the ledger are saying that the fact that there is now disagreement on all of these issues, whether it's on Syria or whether it's on the interference in the election itself, are proof that there was no interference by Russia in the election to help Donald Trump. You have a very unique take on that.
Well, I don't know if it's unique. I'm just saying that Putin certainly, I think the Russians certainly meddled in the elections. I'm just not that certain that they were meddling to specifically help Trump. I think they were going to take down Hillary Clinton. And if Trump gets elected with all his positive overtures towards Putin actually then follows up on that policy, that would be really wonderful. Now, actually, anybody who would analyze anything in politics or foreign policy would know that the Russians and the Americans are on every single issue are different. And I think what's happening now is that this Trump's cowboy mentality that he's going to take on everybody and be friends with whoever he wants to, or enemies with whoever he wants to, just comes to reality, just clashed with reality. And we've already heard for 2 months, 3 months, from all his cabinet members, almost all his cabinet members, that Russia is a problem and he needs to address it. And I think that that's what's happening now. That's why Secretary Tillerson was dispatched to Moscow to see whether the gap is bridgeable at all or not. And what we saw is the gap probably is not bridgeable.
And what we also have seen, Vladimir, is that just in the last couple of weeks, we had Russia vetoing a UN resolution on Syria, condemning them for the attacks and what happened in Syria. It got 10 votes. Russia vetoed it. China abstained. You've also had Donald Trump do something that probably surprised the Putin administration, and that is sending additional military hardware to Eastern Europe as a sign that the U.S. remains committed to NATO, and that the alliance will carry out its policy of building a force to thwart any Russian military action in the region. So with Trump now acting basically more like Jeb Bush than probably what they expected, how do you expect the Putin regime to react?
Well, indeed, in fact, on the same day that Mr. Tillerson was in Moscow, the Russian acting representative of the United Nations vetoed the Syria resolution and, in fact, made a very crude and vulgar speech in a language more appropriate, for a third-rate beer house than for the United Nations Security Council. I know many of my friends and colleagues in Russia felt a sense of shame that such a person is representing our country and speaking on behalf of it. I can certainly say that for myself. I think the way this administration, what this administration is discovering is the same thing that the previous 2 U.S. administrations have discovered, and discovered the hard way, that there can be no convergence of interest and no genuine cooperation between, on the one hand, a system based on, the rule of law and respect for human rights and democratic institutions, and on the other hand, a kleptocratic and authoritarian regime, that is Vladimir Putin's regime in our country. And of course, we remember George W. Bush looking into Putin's eyes and seeing his soul. We remember Barack Obama declaring a reset in relations with the Putin regime. We've heard many of the same things from the current administration. I think they're discovering that this is not likely to happen. And I think there was a very important signal that I believe was missed, unfortunately, this time, that Secretary Tillerson went to Moscow. There was a lot of talk about whether there will be a meeting between Mr. Tillerson and Vladimir Putin, and Mr. Putin kept him, first of all, guessing whether there will be a meeting or not, and then he kept him waiting for a few hours, which is his usual habit, by the way, this kind of primitive, posturing and power play to show who is the boss. This meeting did happen in the end, as you just said. But there was another meeting that didn't happen, and that's a meeting between the U.S. Secretary of State and representatives of Russian civil society. Those kinds of meetings happened under every previous Secretary of State, both parties, Republican and Democrat. That was a long-term tradition. And in fact, just last week, there were several letters sent from the U.S. Congress, again, completely bipartisan, senior Republicans and senior Democrats, urging Mr. Tillerson to find time while he is in Moscow to meet with representatives of Russian civil society, as well as with officials from the Putin regime. Now, regrettably, that meeting did not happen. This was the first visit by Mr. Tillerson as Secretary of State to Moscow, and I think many people were watching for those signals. That meeting did not take place. This is probably not a deliberate snub, and of course it'll be interesting to see if he does find time the next time he goes. But I think it goes to a very important point, that Russia is not only about Vladimir Putin and his regime. And when people talk about relationship and trust and dialogue between the United States and Russia, that should involve dialogue also with different voices in Russian society and with Russian civil society, and not just with the Putin regime that, by the way, is not democratically elected.
Yeah, I mean, that is an excellent point, is that I think we sort of look at Russia and only think about the Putin end of the spectrum, right? But, I mean, where do you see this relationship going? It feels like it's deteriorating, or perhaps it was destined to deteriorate. What do you make of it?
Well, I'm actually never thought that it's going to go anywhere. In fact, I wrote last summer that Putin is a pragmatic politician. He cannot possibly not think that a disaster of Donald Trump is going to work wonders for him. He could have hoped. He thought he could manipulate it. He used it for as long as he could have. But now the reality, as I said, kicked in. For example, yes, not only Tillerson did meet with the civil society members, which I believe that probably in his own pragmatic mind, he really couldn't have done it. But I do hope to see it in the future. But also, he didn't do something that what Russians absolutely wanted to. And that's why Putin met with him, I believe, is that to arrange a meeting between President Trump and President Putin. And that didn't happen. And so as much as Russians want to have a relationship with the United States, they are clearly understanding that the longer that meeting doesn't happen, the more Putin would actually turn to his own devices. And that is a big, big danger. And I agree with Vladimir completely that it is an authoritarian regime. It needs to be talked to. And therefore, the longer it's not talked to, the more authoritarian it becomes.
And very quickly, I mean, the fear that a lot of Americans have, or the sort of underlying undercurrent, is that there is some retaliation that regime might use because it might have something on Donald Trump.
I'm certain, because Putin, as I keep saying, I think on the show, he's an equal opportunity offender.
Sure.
If he hacked Hillary Clinton's campaign, they certainly hacked the Trump campaign.
Yeah.
And they will be very willing to act on it in an act of cyber war, as Malcolm Nunn always reminds us we're here, that would be very dangerous, and then really can turn this relationship into worse ditch that it is on already.
Yeah, it would be absolute chaos. One more question to you, Vladimir, on the protests that we saw, which was pretty extraordinary, the people taking to the streets, protesting the Putin regime. What is the status of that movement, that protest movement against Putin, and where does it go from here?
Well, absolutely. Just a couple of weeks ago, at the end of March, tens of thousands of people went to the streets across Russia, 84 different towns and cities, east to west, Vladivostok to Kaliningrad. And most of those who went out to the streets to protest against the regime were young people, university students, high school kids in many cases, people in their 20s and their 30s and even their teens. And this is the new generation of Russia. These are the faces of tomorrow's Russia. And they're saying no. They're saying enough. And there's frankly not much that Mr. Putin will be able to do with that in the long term or even the medium term. And there's a new wave of protests planned for the next weekend. In fact, the following weekend, a couple of weeks from today. Then there's another wave planned for mid-June. And I think this is not going to stop. This is only the beginning. The young generation of Russians are increasingly realizing that this regime is robbing them, not only literally in terms of the egregious corruption that it's engaging in, and these were, of course, the immediate reasons for the protests, but also robbing them of their future and of their prospects. Russia deserves so much better than a kleptocratic or authoritarian regime, and many, many people are realizing it across the country, and I think this is only the beginning.
Yeah, I think sort of the tragedy for a lot of Americans is that a lot of people, I think, feel that a different kind of American administration might be encouraging those young people and might be standing with them.
My nephew went.
Yeah.
My nephew, 20-year-old nephew, went and screamed against Putin. So here we go.
Makes you wistful for another kind of situation. We'll put it that way. Nina Khrushcheva and Vladimir Kara-Murza, thank you very much. Appreciate you guys.
Thank you.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.